Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo podcast. You are joining Greg Thompson along with Aaron Quinn, and tonight our special guest Christian Page. How is everyone doing?
Buffalo podcast. You are joining.
Doing well.
Awesome.
Glad to finally be on with you guys.
Yeah, we appreciate it, man. It's been a lot of fun as we lead up into getting back to real football things again. It's been interesting when you have kind of the lull between there. We're just kind of filling in time, and now we actually today started to see measurements of adult humans, which is a fun thing.
Oh yeah, that's right up my alley. At least the dullness. Now we have the Alliance League, so it's not as quite as a big time lull anymore. But still, like the real professional football, we got to get back to it.
Aaron and I are aficionados. We have AAF fantasy teams. I think that's as real as it gets.
I'm 3-0.
I suffered my first loss. I'm 2-1 now. Aaron, how are you tonight?
I'm fantastic. It's snowing again here in sunny Buffalo, New York. And I don't know, man. I was looking at some pictures of this time last year, like your social media tells you that. And I was outside playing with my kids, and that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But other than that, it's the combines here. So that provides a little sunshine in my dull, snowy life.
Yeah, it's been decent down here, down in the South. We're doing okay, but yeah, it's a tough time of year. Before we jump into all the fun, just a quick reminder to everybody about all the exciting things going on over at cover1.net. Tonight, you're actually going to hear from one of the experts we have doing all the scouting breakdowns, individual draft profiles, all kinds of updates from the combine all the way through the draft with Christian Page. You also have Russell Brown, you have Jordan, you have Eric and his film breakdowns. We just have a ton of really quality content that's out there, and being able to kind of keep you up to date. It's what I use every time I hear a new name or a player that I'm not familiar with, or I hear an update or some, kind of off the wall take for it. I go back and take a look. Hey, someone who's taken the time to really go through and look at all their film breakdowns. Where are they getting this from? Where are they getting those opinions? Does this hold water? And it's awesome to be able to see that kind of input and that kind of, detailed breakdown into what's there. Aaron, what's your favorite part of the Cover One subscription?
Slack channel. I'm in there all the time. My wife just made a comment the other day. She's like, "You spend an awful lot of time in the chat room of yours." And I said, "Yeah, that's true." And it really is. It's a great value outside of all the other fantastic values that the Cover One premium membership brings you. The Slack channel, I think, is, in my opinion, the best value. It's its own community. Sometimes I get bogged down by Twitter and I have to log off for the day because there's just a lot of negativity. There's a lot of people bringing up points that don't make sense and just hanging on to those arguments. There's good arguments in the Slack channel. And when somebody doesn't make sense or brings up a point that doesn't make sense, everybody's very understanding and really has the ability to have a conversation versus just trying to prove each other wrong. So it's a nice area for Bills fans that are just looking to have a conversation with other Bills fans that you think are somewhat intelligent about the game of football. Plus, Eric is always dropping in nuggets of information to the Slack channel first, whether that's stuff that he's watching while he's watching tape, or little glimpses of things that he's working on, or little tidbits that he finds. He gives us those nuggets, and we're like little peasants that just eat up the crumbs. So it's unlike anything else you get on the internet, especially for Bills fans. The Slack channel is just fantastic.
Yeah, I love it. I try to invite people all the time. Matter of fact, I try to kind of procure and manage my Twitter feed that way, that when I find intelligent people that I really like the back and forth and we end up having a good time, I go right into the DMs. I'm like, hey, if you want to come over to the premium Slack, I spend most of our time over there because I don't have to get back and forth harassing with trolls to be able to go back and forth. It's been awesome. It's such a good community and people who really care about what's going on and take the time to research things, look for who's out there, look for what kind of things are being said, and kind of bring it back and share it with the group. It's really a great community. So I welcome everybody to do it. And we have a $10 special going on right now. So an awesome opportunity to do it. And one of the things you get with that subscription is the fine work of Christian Page. Christian, tell everybody a little bit about what you got going on.
Yeah, so right now you were talking about it. We're in the heart pretty much of draft season, just getting the early portions of the combine, the measurements, and the on-field stuff will start on, Friday, starting with the running backs, offensive line, and the specialists. So we'll definitely have some coverage of that. And a lot of the stuff we like to do is a lot of film analysis, bringing a lot of, the film to written content. So a lot of people don't have to do, the dirty work, if you want to go that far. So we have you covered for that. We like to really break down things more from a perspective where we can reduce it into, words and descriptions that are really easy to read for everybody. But we're not just going to say it. We're not just going to sit there and write it down, but we're actually going to sit there and give you the description and also pair it with the video and the film that we're all working on and everything. So with that said, we have a lot of individual reports. I just had a report last week on Oregon defensive lineman Jalen Jelkes, Amani Oruwariye, the Penn State cornerback, who I think is a top 5 cornerback in this class. And then at the end of the day, or at the end of the week, we'll have, of course, more updates on the combine and just, of course, I think Jordan Reed and Russell Brown, 2 of the other NFL draft analysts, they're doing a podcast, I believe, tonight as well. So still a lot of stuff coming your way from the NFL draft perspective, and of course, just cover1.net as a whole.
No, that's awesome, man. We really appreciate it. And again, we're going to dive in a little bit more detail here tonight. Last week, Jordan got a run on the offensive players, got to talk about some of the skill positions, where we see those fitting in. We'll obviously focus a little bit more on the needs of the Bills and where we see some of that going, but you can kind of take us anywhere you want as we go through the defensive side of the ball here, maybe who you see being someone who stands out with maybe some explosiveness and that are going to get everybody's attention at the combine, or just individual breakdowns. We'll kind of go through position by position as we talk tonight.
Sure, that sounds great.
Aaron, you want to lead us off?
Yeah, I could do that. Honestly, I haven't had a huge chance to look at defensive guys this year. Obviously, the Bills offense is the unit that every fan wants to talk about. Huge struggles, historically bad for a large portion of the season. So obviously we know that's a huge need for the Bills, but I don't think that I think that we know that this team cares about defense and they want to develop some depth on the defense. We lost Kaiir Williams. That is a need that opened up. So I would love to hear your opinion really starting out on the interior defensive line, because I do think that there's maybe some possibilities. We're seeing in some mock drafts where one of these really good defensive linemen fall to the Bills at 9. And if they are unable to trade back, who's maybe possibly going to be there, and maybe some other guys that we could replace that Kaiir Williams type role with, or just a rotational guy in the interior defensive line that Bills fans kind of should be looking out for.
Yeah, this defensive line class, it's interesting because I don't want to call them tweeners, but there's a lot of guys that show some versatility. So guys like Ed Oliver, who you've seen him play that zero tech position up onto the center, playing a little bit of shade, but you've also seen him as a 3 tech. He shows that ability to rush the passer, along with a guy like Shawn Geary. He's not a polished guy on the edge, and I don't think he's a true defensive end, but I think if you're looking at him as probably anywhere from that 3 to 5 tech, I think he could fill a lot of needs. So if the Bills are looking for more versatility across that defensive line, I think there's plenty of opportunities at 9, even if they don't get a guy like Ed Oliver. Of course, Quentin Williams is going to be gone off the board. He's going to be my number 1 overall player when it's all said and done, unless something happens, at the end of the day. But I think when you look at, maybe some sleepers overall, and I don't want to count Jeffrey Simmons, the Mississippi State defensive lineman, as a sleeper, but there's a lot of red flags coming up now. He just recently got diagnosed with a knee injury. He will not be participating at the combine. There's some background issues with him. So if there's something that comes up and there's not a lot of trust from evaluators and decision makers in the first round, if there is a possibility that Jeffrey Simmons falls to round 2, with the Bills have the 40th overall pick, I believe, that would be a home run pick, because I think Jeffrey Simmons shows some top 10 talent. But I think when you're looking at pick number 9, if Ed Oliver's on the board and that's the position they want to solidify, if they choose to go defensive line instead of offensive line, I think Ed Oliver makes a lot of sense based on how Buffalo would like to use him.
Yeah, I'm still trying to convince myself there's a possibility that Quentin Williams falls, but short of somebody photoshopping a bong face mask video, I don't think it's going to happen. I've seen some of your best work. I think you brought up a couple of interesting names, though, and we spent a lot of time with that top pick, so I want to get you into a little bit later, but I know that Shawn Geary and Ed Oliver obviously are discussed as potential opportunities there. I think Jeffrey Simmons, prior to the knee injury, was right in play, but now I really like the idea of maybe snagging him in the second round as kind of a stash for 2020. Who are some of the names maybe a little bit later, some with the depth of this class getting so much attention? Who are some guys that maybe in previous years might have been a late first or an early second round pick that might now get pushed down into the second or third or fourth round, that maybe we could get some value later on, that might be a good name to watch out for?
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing, and that will kind of figure out or give us an indication of how the draft's going to carry. Because if the perception of this class is it is a deep defensive line class, but even though there are some really good, I think there's like a tier 1 and tier 2, but both very solid. If teams are okay of passing on some of those tier 1 players, some of the guys we just talked about, but they feel like the class is strong enough they can wait on later, or does all these teams just kind of stockpile in that first half of the first round, and that leaves some other teams in kind of I don't want to say like a dire situation, but in a sense you could make that case. But I think Jerry Tillery, the defensive tackle out of Notre Dame, I think he shows some versatility. He's not as thickly built as you would want as maybe that interior guy, but I think he shows some pass rushing ability. He has the consistent motor, which I think cannot be said enough for a defensive lineman, because you want a guy that comes in there, wants to be coached. And I think you see that with Tillery. And I think he can really do well rushing the passer inside, and can also show really good ability to defend the run. He has that stack and shed ability and the vision in the backfield, which I think cannot be addressed enough for a defensive tackle. I think he's a guy that we're talking about, that second round pick for Buffalo, I think would make a lot of sense there based on some versatility, because he lined up anywhere from a 0 tech to a 3 tech, a 5, even sometimes a 7 tech, or one of those wide 5 techs, depending on the offensive alignment there. But I definitely think Jerry Tillery, a guy that received a lot of first round hype coming into the year, based on how he was used, I think that's why some of it kind of dwindled down. But I think he screams versatility, and is a guy that has a lot of potential. And I think maybe a couple years from now, we would be wondering why he slipped past maybe the first round.
That's all great information, man, because I really do think, we haven't signed Jordan Phillips yet. And that's starting to make me nervous. I was asked about that on a podcast this week about, are they going to sign him? And I really hope so. If they aren't able to get a deal done with him, then that opens up that hole even more. And with the number of holes, obviously you brought it up, if they decide not to go O-line, I really still in my gut think that O-line is the top priority for this entire front office in free agency and in the draft. So I think they're going to have to get into those later rounds and find those guys like the guys you're talking about that are going to be able to come in and contribute, because fans really like Harrison Phillips, and he was a fun guy in the draft last year, but I think that his ceiling isn't as particularly maybe as high as fans are hoping that it's going to be. I think that he's just like a really solid rotational lineman. I think if you can find another couple of guys like that, that is the ideal world for a Brandon Beane, Sean McDermott defensive line, where guys are just rotating, not playing a huge high amount of snap counts. So all that information gets me very excited about this draft, because with the 10 picks, obviously, like Greg alluded to in the Slack channel, you're not going to take 10 guys. But if you get 7 guys and you can find a defensive lineman that's going to come in and be a contributor in 2018, 2019, that's going to be fantastic. Or 2019.
I think that the comparison to Kyle Williams has almost been a curse for Harrison Phillips. It's unfair to him. He can be a really nice player, but not to that
really, really high bar.
Yeah. Christian, one more defensive tackle question before we move on. A question, one of the guys from the chat. There's 2 names we've seen as maybe later round guys. One got a lot of notoriety from his crazy backflip videos with Kalin Saunders, and the other one got some attention at the East-West Shrine game with Daniel Wise, younger brother of Dietrich Wise from the Patriots. What have you heard on those guys? And are those maybe some kind of like a Harrison Phillips, maybe a mid-round guy that we could get who might be able to come in and contribute?
Yeah, I definitely think they are, and they kind of flew under the radar throughout the season. Of course, Saunders coming from Western Illinois, you expect that. Daniel Wise coming from a program like Kansas, of course, not a lot of hype there, but it gives us more opportunities to see them really stand out on teams that may not have that stacked roster, as opposed to some of the guys we've already mentioned. But starting with Kalin Saunders, his explosiveness shows, yes, in the backflip video, but it also shows on the football field. He has an incredible first step, and he shows he can immediately overwhelm his matchup in the interior. And I think that first step quickness puts a lot of interior linemen in really awkward situation, making them, really think on the fly, which of course we're talking about the NFL. They're trained for those situations. But still, I think when you have that first step quickness, that really goes to, really starts your rep out really well. And then you have to trust your technique throughout the rest of the rep. And I think that's when he really needs or has a lot of question marks, is that overall technique, not really playing low enough to really use that explosiveness to really penetrate the pocket. I think that's something that he's going to have to work on. But I think if you get him in a situation that they will be patient with him, because I don't think he's going to be picked high enough for him to be relied on heavily day one. So I think if there is some patience there, he has, and he really has the explosiveness to work with. I think if you can coach him on some technique and some overall timing, I think you can turn this guy into a late round guy that will really help out a team, at least from a depth perspective, immediately, and eventually ultimately be that starter down the road. And talking about Daniel Wise, I was not at the East-West Shrine game, but I did follow a little bit on social media. I think a lot of the same things can be said about Saunders and Wise, both explosive players. Wise is probably more technical, knows how to really react to certain schemes, whether it's a zone blocking scheme, a man blocking scheme. I see the intangibles from Wise more so than Saunders, but I think both guys are very strong candidates to be those late round sleepers when we're talking about defensive linemen.
That's awesome. And I think the next category we want to get into is kind of underrated in that many fans see Jerry Hughes, they see Trent Murphy, they know about Shaq Lawson, the rotation that we get from Lorenzo Alexander, that maybe they don't expect that to be a pick, especially at number 9. But I actually think with maybe a Josh Allen falling, Montez Sweat, Brian Burns, some of the names that are out there, and the fact that both Shaq Lawson and Jerry Hughes are only under contract through 2019, and the rotation the Bills have, working multiple guys in, 4 guys playing a lot of snaps every game, I actually think it's kind of an underrated possibility that if the board falls right or they trade down, they could see a pass rush guy there. Who are some of the names you saw? Obviously, Bosa gets a ton of attention and is a beast, but once we get past that upper echelon there, who are some of the names you think might be in play for the Bills if they ended up going pass rush in the first round?
Yeah, I agree. I think kind of going back to what I was saying, it may just depend on, how the cards fall in Buffalo's favor. I think they're in a solid position where they could address, possibly get the top offensive lineman, if it's Jawan Taylor, if it's Jonah Williams, but they could also get one of the top 2, top 3 defensive linemen. And going to your question, I think you pretty much hit all the players right on the head there. Montez Sweat, a guy that really showed his ability in Mobile. He has that athleticism, that flexibility. Maybe not overall the lower body anchor and the torque you look for a top 10 defensive lineman. But I think from a production standpoint and from a motor standpoint, I'm going back to that again because I think that's very important from a defensive lineman. But you look at that, I think Sweat checks all the boxes there. You talked about Josh Allen, the possibility of him falling down. Maybe a team kind of questions where they're going to put him schematically. Is he a guy that's going to keep his hand in the dirt in a 4-3 alignment, or is he going to be a guy that shows some coverage ability, can play in the flats, but still rush the passer? So I think those are 2 things that you're going to have to look at with them. But then talking about Brian Burns, Russell and I talked about on the podcast last night. He's not a guy that's probably going to weigh in over the 230 mark, which I definitely think is a major red flag. Because there's rumors that had it. I can't remember who had. I think it was Lance Zierlein had it of NFL Network that said he had a source that told him that Brian Burns was playing at roughly 227 throughout his senior season at Florida State. So I think it's a major red flag in the fact that from a body perspective, you should be able to mature there from your first year to your final year. So I definitely think that could be concerning, but I think he is an option if they believe that he's a polished pass rusher, if they can, figure out if they can use him in their alignment and their scheme. I definitely think Brian Burns, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but if you want a primary pass rusher, which I think the Bills kind of need that dynamic pass rusher, especially the contract situations they're dealing with, even though the defense is solid, there's a lot of foundation pieces elsewhere. I definitely think if you have that primary edge rusher, whether it be kind of that buck or stand-up edge rusher or a true defensive end, I definitely think that would make a lot of sense if the Bills want to do that with their top 10 pick.
Now, what about some guys late? Because we know Brandon Beane has said it openly, and they've kind of preached it in their roster building and how they rotate the defensive line. They aren't necessarily out there looking to hit home runs with the biggest names. They have, we still have Jerry Hughes. We do have Shaq Lawson. Trent Murphy was a big signing a year ago. So I think those are maybe some of the bigger names they're rolling with. But I'm thinking more guys like the Eddie Yarboroughs of the world, rotational defensive linemen that maybe you get late and then can turn into something, develop for a year, 2 years, and be that next guy for them. Is there anybody like that in this draft that they can sneak in late?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there always is. And with a class like this, I definitely think it stacks up well to actually have that opportunity to whether take a risk. I mean, like you're talking about the Bills having their 10 picks. Not expected to keep them all, but still there's a lot of picks to, I guess, quote unquote, play with and kind of risk out there. And I definitely think that's a good situation to be in. But a few guys that I've caught my eye, probably day 3 players. Malik Carney, he's a defensive end, kind of that tweener defensive end from North Carolina. Shows a lot of flexibility, a lot of motor, shows the ability to really play in both levels in the pass game and the running game. So I think, of course, you can check both boxes from a run and pass rushing standpoint. Even if you are a jack of all trades, not in an elite level way, but still, if you can sit there and check on both aspects of the game, I definitely think you could be a late round flyer. Another guy that comes to mind, Deandre Walker out of Georgia. Was expecting to see him at the Senior Bowl. We didn't get an opportunity, but a guy that I don't think necessarily blossomed at Georgia, but shows a lot of edge rushing potential. He might be another scheme dependent guy, whether you want to have him, standing up straight or if you want him with his hand in the dirt. But I think he's another guy that could possibly, depending on how he tests, maybe get in that day 2 category. But one of my favorite guys in this class from a defensive line perspective is Granderson, defensive end out of Wyoming. Was in the news lately. He's got his combine invitation rescinded because there are some background issues with, I believe it's domestic violence. So some things will have to be cleaned up. But if the Bills trust that their process of getting this guy to a mature level of professional athlete, I really think he would be a home run pick based on his ability to play both run and pass. And I keep stressing that over and over again. But I think when you're looking at these quality guys that have played for 3 or 4 years and can do that both to nearly perfection, you really can't go wrong. And I think Granderson's a guy that checks all those boxes.
Yeah, I was sad to see the news of Granderson because he's been a guy that I'm hoping can fall to the Bills late, assuming that they've gotten a lot of scouting in on him. And it's a shame when you see those types of things happen to prospects, and just a shame in general. But hopefully it clears up and he can still be a prospect that flourishes in the NFL. But I like Granderson a lot too.
Moving on to our next spot, a position, again, that I think it's easy to say this over and over again with the Bills, that it's a sneaky need. But when you have a strong defense that you're returning, probably 10 out of 11 starters, it's kind of easy to say that kind of thing. But a spot that maybe we need another level of youth to come in as someone to train behind a Lorenzo Alexander, or the free agent target many are looking at as kind of a locker room leader in Thomas Davis. What are your thoughts on where the linebacker crew is? There's a lot of talk about how strong the defensive line is, both D tackle and defensive end. Some of the other positions, beyond Devin White, I actually don't hear a lot about the linebackers in this draft. What are you hearing overall about the class? And maybe, I don't think the Bills are looking at a day 1 or probably even a day 2 pick, but maybe who's someone later that you think might have an opportunity to come in and develop with a year or two with some athletic skills and the kind of profile that might be able to fit?
Yeah, the linebacker position, it's almost kind of weird to evaluate every year because I feel like the perception of it, especially if you're looking at an inside linebacker class, the perception of it always seems like, yeah, it's okay at best. And like you can still hear that perception here, but it's like you heard that last year. Leighton Vander Esch was an all-rookie type player. Darius Leonard was an all-rookie type player in the Indianapolis Colts. So you can sit there and point your finger at that. But I definitely think it is weaker compared to the other defensive units in this draft class. Obviously, you talked about Devin White, the linebacker out of LSU, Devin Bush, linebacker out of Michigan, and Mack Wilson out of Alabama. Those are the 3 guys that, are the first names that pop up when you're talking about linebackers. But for the Bills' sake, if you're looking at a guy later, possibly late day 2 or early day 3 or somewhere on those lines, Terrell Hanks, the linebacker out of New Mexico State, a guy, one of the first invites to the Reese's Senior Bowl. And I didn't know anything about him, to be honest. I didn't know, but I trusted Jim Nagy in his process. And I don't want to say he stole the show at the Senior Bowl, but he definitely got people to really pull up New Mexico State's film and really focus in on him. Attractive athleticism, very easy movement skills, barely shows any lapses in run fits or in pass coverage, really flourishes against tight ends and running backs out of the backfield. So I think Terrell Hanks, if you're wanting that guy that needs a little bit of polish and that could develop under a guy like Alexander and the Bills coaching staff, I think Terrell Hanks is a guy, an outside linebacker that could really answer a lot of questions and maybe a need that you're saying, a lot of Bills fans may not necessarily recognize off the bat.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot of questions about linebacker because, Greg alluded to. I think Mamelon is going to come back strong. Edmonds, I think, is only going to grow. I do think they're going to try to ride it out this next year. But one thing, is there any of these guys that always tend to come up, safeties that can come up and play a linebacker? I know we had Raphael Bush kind of playing that big nickel that Sean McDermott likes to run. Is there anybody that kind of is that tweener between a safety and a linebacker that the Bills can maybe snag as a special teams ace? I know we got Ciaran Neal last year, didn't really make the development throughout the year that we wanted to see. Maybe he develops in year 2, but it seems that they're maybe looking for a guy like that. Anyone like that stand out for you?
It's funny, one of the guys that I have written down as safety here, he's an extra linebacker with hip power, and that's Jonathan Abram out of Mississippi State. He's going to be a guy that has to be picked in the second round. I think he's a top 50 talent in this class. When it's all said and done, he could be possibly the second or third best safety outside of Nasir Adderley out of Delaware, Deontay Thompson out of Alabama. But Abram, he's solid in coverage in both areas. Maybe not as technique as a tackler as you're expecting, so you may want to see him more as a free safety. But I think if you want him in a situation where he could play close to the line in kind of that strong safety role, play in the box, I think he has that ability to stack and shed, has very good vision in the run game, and shows off enough athleticism for that position at safety, or as that extra linebacker you like to call it. Jonathan Abram's a guy from a height weight threshold. I think he answers the call, and just from a mentality, really has that linebacker mentality at safety.
Greg, do you have any more linebacker questions? Because I get real antsy about DBs, and I'll get into that when you're ready.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to lean into it. So whether it's that kind of guy, like you said, that tweener safety linebacker, my thought for where the Bills are going to be looking, short of cornerback 2 is one that we'll talk about here, competing with Levi Wallace. But if they draft a linebacker or a safety, in my mind, it's going to be 95% on special teams. So I'm curious for a guy that maybe has that long-term potential, the athletic skills to be a gunner, to be a punt coverage guy, to be a kickoff coverage guy, and then maybe a second, third, fourth year develops into a playable linebacker. But is there a guy that you see maybe in that mold, or that maybe molds into a safety, or a guy that you were talking about on that might be kind of a tweener between a safety linebacker, but that I'm really focused on that special teams ability and giving our new special teams coordinator Heath Farwell some talent to work with. And I think that's where the Bills might use some of those later day 3 picks to fill in some of the depth on the roster.
Yeah, that's a tough question, because there is a lot of guys that, have that ability to play on special teams and eventually work their way up to possibly a starting position. A guy that stands out to me, he's not really in that mold of a tweener between linebacker and safety, but I think he has the developmental skills to be a consistent player on special teams and eventually turn into a very reliable depth piece. That's Marquise Blair out of Utah. Safety, a guy, we're talking about the Senior Bowl. Jim Nagy was very high on him, and I think that goes to show how much confidence he has in his evaluation and how connected he is in the NFL to think this highly of Blair. But I think a guy that can run like a deer. He doesn't have necessarily the overall tackling technique that you want, but I think if you want to put him as possibly a gunner, I don't know if he necessarily has that speed, but work his way up and getting those high percentage of special teams rep and eventually turn as a depth piece. And then maybe somewhere down the line, he turns into a reliable starter. I think Marquise Blair, possibly, I would say maybe the 4th round, 5th round would be a good pick for Buffalo.
Awesome stuff. So cornerback, I think, for the Bills is a position of need that's a very sneaky one that people aren't really talking about, because Levi Wallace came on at the second half of the year. He did perform well. I don't know that he's going to be able to consistently do that, especially with some film out there on him. I think he's okay. I really like him as a backup cornerback, maybe pushing in camp. But I do think that we need to fix the position across from Tre'Davious White. I love Tre'Davious White. He needs something over on the other side of him. I don't know that they go real early for it, but my motto with cornerbacks has always been bring as many of those guys in to camp as possible, because it's a passing league. It's a position that gets injured a lot. You can't really have enough of those guys. Draft them every year, bring these guys in. I fell in love last year with Dante Jackson, and I'm looking at the cornerback rooms. I see some good cornerbacks, but I haven't seen anyone I fall in love with. I want to leave here tonight after talking to you, Christian, drooling over a cornerback that I'm just going to put on my crush list along with Irv Smith and guys like that. So convince me of a cornerback that I'm going to fall in love with this year.
One of the guys that I fell in love with, of course, I really like Byron Murphy, but he's kind of the mainstream top guy.
Right.
A+ instincts, has that toughness, has good ball production, over 27 pass defended over the past couple year or past year, I guess. He's only a first-year starter. Has some technique issues, but I think when you're looking at a 19, 20-year-old guy, I think there's a lot of developmental things that you can really fix from a technique standpoint. But I mentioned him right when we got in here. Amani Oruwariye, the Penn State cornerback. I'm going to call him Amani O because I'm going to butcher his name eventually.
You're already better than we are.
Yeah, no, it's difficult. And even the pronunciation guy does not help me whatsoever with his name because I feel like it's different everywhere. But besides the point, one of the smartest cornerbacks I have evaluated. I haven't been a scout that long, but in the past 3 to 4 years, I would say you can just see that his instincts and his intelligence jumps off the tape. And that's one of those traits that's really hard to kind of hone in on when you're an evaluator, to really focus in on, because it's something that you want to have it backed up by a coach or a teammate or something like that. But it's so evident when you can see it on tape. And when it's that evident, you know that he just oozes with that kind of high football intelligence. And Oruwariye is definitely one of those guys that I think embodies all that. Almost, he's an extra edge setter in the run game. Russ was talking about last night how there was a game, I forget who it was against. I want to say Michigan State, but he was lined up, I think, on the left side, and they audibled to run it to the right side just because they feared of him being on the edge. He's a consistent tackler. He's sticky in coverage. He's probably more of a boundary corner. He uses that sideline as his best friend. I think he'll struggle a little bit over the middle and some intermediate and quicker routes. But overall, he's long. He has some ball production, and he's one of the smartest cornerbacks I've evaluated in quite some time. So he's definitely one of my favorite draft prospects in this entire class.
What round grade do you have on him right now? Where do you have him?
He's going to be a borderline first-round guy for me. I think he's a top 40, top 50 talent, so it's going to put you in that situation. Well, should we trade up in the first round right there just to solidify it? But maybe just based on how he tests, he's not necessarily going to threaten top 15, top 20 with his speed. So that may actually benefit Buffalo more if we're just going to use them as an example, looking at that 40th pick. But he's a guy that I definitely has top 40, top 50 talent. It's probably most likely going to be my cornerback 2 or 3.
I know a name that we've got started to hear. One, it's an awesome name in Rock Ya-Sin, and then another guy that's kind of a tweener between safety and corner, Nasir Adderley. Those are some names that, maybe if things fall right, maybe we can get lucky in the third round to have them fall. Are there some guys in that kind of middle range there where maybe we do solidify the offensive line or defensive line, maybe trade down and pick up an extra second or a third that puts one of those guys in play? But who are some guys maybe in that second tier of corners that we should keep an eye on?
Yeah, it depends on where teams really evaluate Adderley. Most likely he's going to be a first-round pick, so I think possibly looking at a second or third-round scenario, he's not going to be part of the conversation. I think athletically he's going to test well, very reliable in his overall coverage. I evaluate him more as a free safety. I don't think his really press man cover skills or his ability in the slot really screams a cornerback that you want to take with your first round pick. But yeah, I think there's a few guys that you can look back in maybe that second or third round range. Joanne Williams out of Vanderbilt, he's a long, probably about 6'2.5", right around 195, 200 pounds. Not as physical as he may indicate, but I think a guy that really thrives in zone coverage. So if that's what Buffalo's looking for, Joanne Williams, I fell in love with him when he was a sophomore. There's tweets out there to document that, so I'm not jumping on the bandwagon. He seems like one of the sexier cornerbacks out there right now. But he's a guy that I think can work into being a guy that produces a lot of ball production. Because of course, when you're looking at that second or third round range for a cornerback, you want the ability to turn the ball over, or at least get the defense off the field as soon as possible. He doesn't necessarily have that overall lockdown island corner ability. But I think with his length, his athleticism, and his work in progress with physicality, I think he could definitely get there.
Now, we've talked a little bit about the cornerback position. I don't think that Bills are going to be really looking to solidify anything at the nickel position at all, so we don't really have to talk about those guys. I also don't think that safety is going to be really something that's in play. Obviously, you have Poyer, Hyde, and they've had the ability to find other guys behind him. You have Marlowe, Bush, so that's a pretty good group. Sierra Neal's still going to have a roster spot, but kind of to Greg's point on the linebacker thing, is there any of those guys real late that if we can't somehow get rid of all those picks and you got some picks to play with, are there any of these guys in the back there that you would just bring in as a special teams guy, practice squad type guy, just kind of take a waiver on and it's before they hit the undrafted free agency and see where they're at?
As in linebackers?
No, for safety.
Oh, for safety. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always a few. Sheldrick Redwine, kind of going to your tweener conversation, I believe he was a full-time safety at Miami, but when the initial Senior Bowl roster came out, he was listed as a cornerback. So it makes you wonder how he projects as a prospect. I think he's a guy that still not a polished guy, but I think he has some versatility. And I think he's definitely worth a draft pick later on because you can work him into a position like I was talking about Marquise Blair out of Utah, guy that has a lot of athleticism. He's another guy that I think you can tell that plays with a high football intelligence. Again, I tell you, that's really hard and kind of difficult to find when you're just watching film. But when it's evident, it's definitely easy to make note of. But I think he's a guy, Darnell Savage, kind of undersized, safety out of Maryland. I think he shows a lot of potential there. So there's definitely a lot of guys that can serve as those 6th or 7th round picks that you draft as a special teams guy. But there's still a lot of potential based on their track record and what they've done in college that they could turn into a potential depth piece.
No, it's interesting. Hey, a question I want to kind of put you on the spot for here as fans are getting ready. It's interesting how the NFL has now not only turned the combine into a television event, but now a weekend television event where they put it on all day, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I'm going to ask you a twofold question. Okay. One, who is a prospect that you're high on that you think is going to really test off the charts and confirm your grade of how talented he is? And then on the other side of that, who is a guy that you're going to warn us about now that, hey, he's going to put up some lights out numbers, but don't believe the hype. He's a workout warrior and doesn't have it on the field. So give me a guy that you think, two guys who are both going to do well this weekend, but one that we should believe in and one that maybe we should take with a grain of salt.
Man, you did put me on the spot there. That is a tough question. No, it's hard because I think a lot of the guys that are getting that praise, as in they're big-time athletes, they're going to test very well. I think it's all justified. But a guy that really comes to mind that there's rumors out there right now that he's possibly going to run a 4.5 at 290 pounds or whatever he is Shawn Geary out of Michigan. He's not necessarily a polished pass rusher. I mentioned that early on. And he kind of has that, you have to figure out, well, is he going to be a 5-tech that we can maybe scoot him in just a little bit more on, pass rushing situations? But I think he's a guy that's probably going to test pretty well. But he could go under that boomer bust category because he only had, I believe, right under 10 sacks his entire career at Michigan. A guy that can be a penetrator in the backfield. But I think his numbers are going to show out really well, especially when you look at the 40 time, which depending on who you talk to, the 40 time can be incredibly overrated, especially for the caliber of a defensive lineman. I think it's more of that 10-yard split that's important, but he's a guy that stands out that might test well, but it could be buyer beware because I think there are some inconsistencies on tape that I think will come to haunt him and the team that picks him early on in the draft because he's going to be a top 15 pick. When it's all said and done. And I'll stick with the defensive line theme, talking about, guys that may not necessarily test well, but I think their tape's pretty good. It's a guy that caught my eye at the Senior Bowl. He was a 5-star recruit coming into Texas A&M, did not live up to the hype until really the end of his junior year and then his senior year. Dalen Mack out of Texas A&M, kind of more of that true zero tech. He even mentioned that he's like, hey, I'm going to face it. I'm going to play nose guard. He's only about maybe a hair over 6 foot, going to be around 315, 320 pounds. He shows some two-gapping ability, not enough to necessarily be perceived and have that really underlined in his scouting report. But I think he is a guy, he carries his weight well, but probably not well enough to really post some numbers in the combine. So I definitely think that he could maybe fly under the radar. He gained some buzz at the Senior Bowl in his own element when he's really playing for himself. But I think a guy that really improved his tape from about 2016, 2017 to 2018. He really put a bow on a solid 2018 senior season, showed that at the Senior Bowl. And I think if he can do well in the interview process, wouldn't be surprised if his draft projection jumps a couple rounds to possibly the 5th, maybe even 4th round, talking about day 2, because I think Dalen Mack has that impact. But again, He's a true defensive tackle, true nose tackle, and how those players are evaluated and projected in the NFL draft these days doesn't speak very highly, but I think a team's going to really fall in love with when they turn on his 2018 tape.
I got one question to put you on the spot. You're Brandon Beane. You're sitting at 9. No one's trading back with you. Bosa and Quinnen are off the board. Knowing the Bills' needs, what are you doing? Who are you taking?
I'm probably taking an offensive tackle, and that's probably not the answer you want, which, I mean, if you want to sit here and say Buffalo needs a right guard, if they need a right tackle, depending on what they're going to do with Deion Dawkins, Jonah Williams could be that guy. Of course, you hear the guard tackle talk. Where is he going to be? His arms come in just a hair under 34 inches today, which is not bad. I think that you can definitely show that he can play tackle that position. And, I mean, he dominated SEC play. He didn't have a great national championship game. But if you can dominate the SEC play with quote-unquote short arms, I think you're going to be just fine at the NFL. But I like Jonah Williams. He maybe not necessarily met that top 10 overall quality that you're looking for, but I think it's between him and Jawan Taylor out of Florida, a guy that's really shown a maturity. We were talking about that Brian Burns out of Florida State showing that not necessarily weight fluctuation, but not that ability to put on weight. Jawan Taylor's actually lost over probably 30 to 40 pounds since he came on to Florida's campus. And every year you saw him really solidify, turning into that top 50 player, that top 25 player. And I think now you're looking at possibly a top 15 player. So I definitely think Buffalo has to address the offensive line, especially that tackle position. Depending on left tackle, right tackle, you can have the conversation, depending on what you want to do with Deion Dawkins. But I'm not as sold on this offensive tackle class as maybe some other guys are. So I definitely think when you have probably the first shot at one, you definitely take the guy that you think's the best at that position.
Do you think that some of the other names, and I assume this is where you're going with not being as sold, do you think that the Cody Ford, the Greg Little, the Yadni Kajust, the Andre Dillard, do you think that they're in a fully next tier, or are they just a little bit lower but in the similar caliber to Jonah and to Jawan Taylor?
I think Yadni Kajust is probably in that tier too. I think the biggest issue with him is going to be overall flexibility. Can he consistently drop his weight, anchor and pass protection? He shows he's very physical. He wins in a phone booth, like scouts like to say it. So he'll hit you in the mouth. He's very physical. Cody Ford, I think it's more of his feet. He has that extension. He has that technique with hand placement and timing. But I think he has a little bit of choppy footwork. So I think he's going to have to be a work in progress in that regard. Greg Little, as people know on Twitter, I think he's one of the more overrated players in this draft. I hate to say that.
I haven't found anyone who likes him. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, it's like I don't like to sit here and be like, this guy's going to be the guy that busts in the draft. But based on a projection, I think he is. His hand placement is a mess. Sure, he's very strong, but I think his anchor's inconsistent. His timing's inconsistent. His punch is very inconsistent. In the run game, sometimes he just looks lackadaisical when he's going to the second level. I understand some of the hype from a physical standpoint, but I think overall, I don't know why he was voted as an all-SEC teamer, and I just don't really understand the hype when you're looking at even a top 50 player. I believe he's a third-round grade for me right now. He could probably be molded into a guy that you'd feel somewhat comfortable as maybe a swing tackle, but right now, I don't necessarily think, based on projection, that he's going to be a guy that really figures out all the problems for a team that needs an offensive tackle.
Awesome. You got anything else for him, Greg? I can't think of any other combine questions right now.
No, we've gone through a lot, and obviously the most important part of the combine is the part we don't see. We're going to see measurements, we're going to see running, but the medical evaluations and the interviews is really where they make their money. And then going out to St. Elmo's and getting drunk and digging up rumors is the part I'll be most excited about. But is there anything else we should keep an eye out for this weekend? Things that you've looked at, things that we should try to keep in mind as we hear or take with a grain of salt coming out of this combine?
Yeah, that's definitely true. A lot of rumors. I mean, whether, the Kyler Murray, Steve Keim stuff's coming out right now, whether or not 100% sold that Kyler or that Josh Rosen would be. But for right now, he is. Well, of course, Steve. But again, that could be smoke and mirrors. That could be trade bait. Hey, somebody come get the first overall pick. will let you have an opportunity to get Kyler Murray or Dwayne Haskins, whoever you perceive as the top quarterback in this class. So that's definitely what's going on right now. But as far as just keeping up with the combine, like you said, the most important things about this event is what happens literally behind closed doors in certain interviews and how players really address hard-hitting questions, whether necessarily about the X's and O's or just from some background situations. So a lot of things come out from drug tests, from injuries, from personal backgrounds. And I think those are some things that you can definitely pay attention to, because if it's documented and coming from reporters, that means definitely you can take it with a lot of weight, because of course it's going to be truer statements. But from trade perspectives, this team likes this player wants to play for this team. He always hated playing under this coach. I don't want to say don't believe any of that, but believe maybe like 2.5% of it, because it doesn't necessarily always come to fruition.
No, I think it's a great warning and something that it's healthy to be able to look into and kind of wait and see what we're going to get back from, what is really Lion season. There's no incentive for any GM or assistant GM or any head coach to put anything genuinely truthful out there, because they just don't benefit from it. So I think that it's very healthy to take that with a very large grain of salt.
I love salt.
All right, before we say goodbye to everybody, Christian, one more reminder for the folks and what you're working on next, what they can keep an eye out for, and where they can find you on Twitter.
Yeah, you can find me at Twitter @_Christian Page. You can follow all of our draft content. Russell Brown and Jordan J.R. Reed do an excellent job of covering the draft with me. We have a lot of stuff coming out based on whether it's combine results, some of the stories that we're talking about. Russ just posted something today about the Arizona Cardinals and the Kyler Murray relationship. JR just released his top 50 prospects heading into the combine. And Friday morning, I'm going to have a couple of sleeper cornerback prospects that I did not mention on purpose on the podcast, a duo from Central Michigan that I think you can find in day 3 that kind of give you I guess some versatility. One's more of a physical press corner. That's Shaun Bunting, and then Xavier Crawford, more of that kind of longer, leaner corner, plays better off the ball and has that really smooth transition skill. So look for that Friday morning. Of course, like I said, Russell and Jordan, I believe, are working on a podcast right now. So you can check that out tonight and check that out in the morning too.
Awesome. Aaron, where can the people find you, and where are you doing your most damage?
Yeah, actually, you can find me often in Russell Brown's mentions, because he and I are battling back and forth over Irv Smith Jr. and who has claimed the stake to Irv Smith. So you'll see a lot of that on Twitter. But you can find me at Aaron Quinn 716, engaging in every type of conversation I can. And you can't offend me. So come on over and let's get involved in Twitter. And you can also find me in the Cover One Premium Slack channel. I'm there all the time.
Absolutely. Just another quick reminder to check out everything we have going on at cover1.net, whether it's Christian, like you said, Jordan Reed, Russell Brown, Eric, everything that we have going on, just some fantastic content, totally worth the investment. I can't even describe how many silly things I waste $10 on. So take advantage while we have that special going on. Jump in there. It's worth your money and then some. The premium channel Slack is worth it by itself, let alone the incredible content you get access to and the inside information that you get on what video breakdowns are coming next, questions on what you want to see Eric do video breakdowns on. You get input on what you're going to see. So come and check that out. You can find me in the premium channel Slack all the time, a silly amount of time. And you can also find me on Twitter at Greg Thompsett, GregTompsett. Love to follow back Bills fans and have a good time on there. Guys, anything else for the people before we sign out?
Yeah, no, you do. You are in there a lot. I often wonder, you tell us you have this cool job and you talk about your job, and then I see you in Slack and I'm not sure. I think that maybe you just are sitting in that basement of yours all the time on Slack.
It's a secret. It's a secret.
It really is. The Slack channel really is fun. And I got a warm welcome because I'm all the way in Alabama. So Buffalo, like it doesn't come up in many conversations here. But I posted in the Slack channel, gosh, it was probably 2 or 3 months ago, but I went and found a Buffalo Bills sweatshirt and I bought it. And I was like, I have the commitment because the Bills Mafia, they accepted me in the Slack channel. And so I embraced it and I wore it out in town in Auburn, Alabama the other night. So I'm definitely embracing it and mostly due in part because of Cover One and the Slack channel.
All right. Love it. Bills Mafia is a welcoming crew. We're
definitely.
We're good.
Unless
people.
you're a Patriots fan, then we'll probably tar and feather you.
All right, guys. Thank you for a great talk tonight. Awesome work, Christian. We appreciate it. Thank you for an awesome chat. Had great interaction all night. Really love it. And we will talk to you guys next week.